Colonel Douglas Macgregor is the oracle. There is nothing about military and political military affairs that he is not a master of. He's a retired US Army colonel, he's an author and a defence and foreign policy consultant, and an all-round good guy, as a fellow Scotsman usually is. Colonel Macgregor, thanks for joining us. We've got a lot of wars to cover, so let me press on immediately. I'm very worried indeed about the Persian Gulf. The Russians have evacuated their embassy in Tel Aviv, and the Americans have abandoned two of their most vulnerable military bases in Iraq, very peremptorily indeed. And Russia kind of knows from both sides what's going on. They have a relationship with Israel, and they have a very close relationship now with Iran. They seem to think, and the American government seems to think, that the balloon might be about to go up there again. Do you think so?
I've been expecting something in September, latest October, because the Greater Israel Project has no chance of success. And I think Mr. Netanyahu knows this, unless they can ultimately balkanize and destroy Iran. So the war has to continue. There's no question about that if you're an Israeli. On the other hand, I'm not sure exactly when. I know that a lot of materiel, theater high altitude air defense missiles and equipment are being shipped to Israel. So I know we're busy trying to assist the Israelis with regard to defending themselves. And of course, they have limitless ammunition from us and whatever else they need. I know the Russians have been on the ground in Iran trying to repair, restore, and ultimately improve their integrated air defenses. So a war is inevitable in terms of, happening again. We just don't know exactly when. And these evacuations from Iraq are interesting, because I remember when President Trump was president the first time around in 2020, when I was working for him, he was very interested in getting us completely out of Syria and Iraq. And of course, he was obstructed at that point. So for this to happen suggests that something is indeed building, but none of us knows when or how it will happen.
Well, turning then to the war that we know all too much about and that is still raging, it's a commonplace to state that Donald Trump hasn't ended the Ukraine war in 24 hours or 24 weeks. He is, in a sense, whilst not financially, he says, doubled down on the war. He has empowered the seven dwarves of the European Union, as long as they buy the weapons from him. He's quite happy for the European Union to supply limitless weapons, limited only by questions of industrial capacity, but to empty their armories, give everything to Ukraine, and for that weaponry to include the potential to penetrate deep into the Russian heartland. I'm thinking of the new cruise missile allocation, which Trump announced, which I think it was 2,000 or 3,000 units will go to Ukraine. These are well capable of penetrating into Russian territory deeply. So what is it? Was Trump lying when he said he wanted to end the war in Ukraine? Or was he telling the truth but is simply unable to do so? And if it's the latter, why?
I think the second answer that you provide is accurate. And I think that's what he finally concluded after he met in Alaska with President Putin. I don't think President Trump, who is certainly not a student of European history, culture, economics, geography, ever really understood the complexity of the issues in Ukraine. I don't think he completely grasped what he was dealing with. Whether or not he does now is open to question, but he certainly did not until he got to Alaska. I think you're raising a very important question. If you're sitting in Moscow and you're looking at events, you're saying, well, first of all, we had a good meeting with President Trump and his team. Remember, they met previously in Saudi Arabia, and on both occasions, both teams said they'd made some progress in the direction of normalizing relations with Russia, and that's something that President Trump has said he wanted to do. However, having done that, that of course did not address Ukraine, and I think he decided that, I can't fix Ukraine. I can't solve this, which is something he should have understood from the beginning. I think he does understand that. On the other hand, I think he's being advised by people who are telling him, well, you can't just walk away. And remember, that was what I urged from the beginning, very early on to President Trump was, look, let's leave this. Announce you're suspending all further armaments. We'll send humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainians. But the best way to end this war is to stop the flow of cash and weapons to Ukraine. At that point, the war has to stop because the Ukrainians really are at the end of their tether as it is. The Russians will then begin to take us seriously. I think he's been urged by everybody on the Hill and elsewhere not to do that. In other words, he's turned out to be like too many politicians, George. He wants to be a little bit pregnant. So he's straddling the proverbial fence. Now, this latest announcement is horrific. The notion that we would send thousands of cruise missiles over there is insane to begin with. Secondly, it's not going to happen very quickly because we can't build that many in the time that remains for Ukraine. So I think the Russians are looking at this and saying, we don't have any choice anymore. We've got to end this war. So we're going to press ahead. Now, what does press ahead mean? Well, they've already got special operations forces on the outskirts of Odessa. They've already destroyed all potential military targets in and around Odessa. They're going to move towards Zaporizhia. They're going to get complete control of Kherson, all of the areas in southern Ukraine. There's no choice in that matter. And eventually, I think we'll see them occupy Odessa. I've always felt that way. They've said that for the last 3 years. And you'll remember that Russians were herded into buildings in Odessa and then burned alive by the Ukrainians down there. That's something the Russians have never forgotten, and I would not forget that either. So I think those things are on the table. The question is, do you cross the river in strength and go north to Kiev? In other words, you eliminate the cancer because they don't want to refight this war in the future. And now it seems that MI6 in London is very interested in pushing this man Zaluzhny, who is ostensibly their puppet. That's not going to fly with Moscow. They will not accept that under any circumstances. And then finally, at least President Trump has now said, as I understand it, there will be no U.S. forces on the ground in Ukraine. Now, we've had this confusion over the last several days. Well, we may do this, we may not. I'm hearing he says no. The president of Poland, who is very much an important actor in all of this, has said no Polish troops on the ground in Ukraine. And as I've said from the very beginning, you didn't have Poland at this summit in the White House. Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, they border Ukraine. They are key to the outcome. They've been treated as though they're second-class citizens, irrelevant. They have to be on board for whatever happens in Ukraine. So I think that summit in the White House was a serious mistake. You called them the seven dwarves. The people that came in there were a disaster because they have nothing at stake. What they say is irresponsible. Starmer talking about what? 30,000 British troops? Good luck. The British Army, as you and I both know, is a shadow of its former self. It's in bad shape. It's really tragic. The same thing is true in France. As a friend of mine in the French Army says, the only thing we're prepared to do is go on safari in Africa. So there's 60,000 troops. And then I listened to a British analyst who came on, and I've forgotten his name, but he explained that you would have to have at least 300,000 troops that would operate effectively along the border of Ukraine to guarantee anything. And then finally, the Russians have said, if you move any troops in there from Western Europe, that's a red line for us. You make yourselves a co-belligerent, we'll attack you. So where are we? I think we're where we thought we would always be for months. And every time I've talked to you, this has come up, really. Who is going to determine the outcome? Russia. How will it be determined? On the ground in Ukraine. End of discussion. And in the meantime, NATO is falling apart. Anybody who thinks that's robust and capable is crazy. The same thing is true for the EU. If you live in Hungary and Slovakia and Poland, you're being told you need to accept 1 million people from Africa, the Middle East, and Southwest Asia. These people have said, no, thank you. We're not interested in that. We see what's happened in Great Britain. We've seen what's happened in Germany and Italy and France. We don't want that here. Everything is falling apart in the West. Nothing is working. So in the final analysis, Russia is winning this war, and it will determine the outcome. We won't.
Now, the Ukrainian authorities themselves, we learned from leaked documents this week, indicate that they have lost 1.7 million men. These are First World War levels of casualty. That's not just killed in action, it's also missing in action. But a very significant number of those are almost certainly dead and being concealed as being dead because it saves Zelensky paying out death benefit to their widows and families. 1.7 million Ukrainians missing in action or killed in action, plus 250,000 deserters, plus 9 million Ukrainians living outside in our countries at our expense and not very well received, frankly, in most polite society. I saw some of them in Canada, I think it was, complaining about the miserly $2,000 a month that they were being given by the Canadian taxpayer. They are going to remain in those countries. Ukraine is effectively a failed state now, isn't it?
I think the nation of Ukraine, if we want to call it that, is in ruins, thanks to this man Zelensky and his backers in Washington and London primarily. No, if you look at Poland right now, the Polish president, in addition to saying we're not going to send any more troops to Ukraine, they sent several thousand over there. They lost at least 2,000 killed trying to help the Ukrainians. They've said no more, out of the question. They've got several million Ukrainians in Poland. 1 out of 5 of them is applying for citizenship in Poland. So the Poles are now struggling with this because Poland is not that large a country. They've already got 40 plus million. They would like most of these Ukrainians to go home. And you're right, in Austria, where they have a lot of them, people are on the streets saying, stop importing, start deporting. Now, they're not just talking about unwanted Ukrainians. They're talking about large numbers of people from overseas that are non-Europeans. But your point is absolutely valid. This is a disaster. Now, I said a couple of weeks ago when I was asked 1.8 million had been killed, and I was viciously attacked. Now they're saying 1.7. It's actually over 1.7. My sources are Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian. And what they try to do is the following. They try to read all the obituaries, actually visit the cemeteries, visit the hospitals, and more important, some of them have had the opportunity through commercial satellite coverage to find the mass graves. You were talking about people being killed and not reported. There are mass graves in eastern Ukraine of Ukrainian soldiers. Literally thousands in these graves, essentially bulldozed into the dirt and forgotten because the regime doesn't want to do what you described. And remember, you have so much corruption inside this military. If you want to be evacuated from the battlefield, you have to pay somebody in an ambulance to drive you to a hospital. What kind of an evacuation system is that for a military establishment? Ukraine is destroyed. It's finished. If President Trump really understood any of this, he would do what I said to begin with. Simply suspend the aid, say this regime is not legitimate, it's over. But he refuses to do that. You know, we have a similar situation, as you're well aware, in the Middle East. I think if President Trump really understood the reality on the ground in Gaza, he would stop supplying the Israelis. But he can't do that. He refuses to do that. We are prisoners of all sorts of forces right now in the United States, none of which are in our interest. Some of these are big donors. Some of these are political, industrial, but they're all bad. So the only conclusion I think most Americans can reach is We're not represented in Washington. Our government is divorced from us. I think you and many of your fellow citizens are reaching a similar conclusion.
For sure. Now, earlier I interviewed your friend and mine, Larry Johnson. He was, as always, in tropical splendor. I wondered if he was on his way to Venezuela. And I asked him if he'd feel safe going to Venezuela. Is Trump really going? We talked about the 7 dwarfs. He's got 7 warships off the coast of Venezuela and 4,000 Marines. What are they doing, Colonel?
Well, there are 7 warships. I don't know if there are 4,000 Marines. I was told there are 4,000 Marines and sailors. That's not exactly an invasion force. But I must tell you that I see a tremendous amount of resemblance between Maduro and Saddam Hussein. If you put them side by side, they begin to look a lot alike. And we're seeing the same playbook applied. Demonize Maduro the way we demonize Saddam Hussein. You know, even though privately you can find a lot of people that will say, damn, we should have left Saddam Hussein in charge in Iraq. We were better off then than we are now. That may be true, but the problem with Maduro is very simply, he has a very large country. This place is the size of France and Germany combined. Only got 26 million people, but millions live on the coast in those big cities. However, and this should not be overlooked, it's probably 3rd in the world, maybe 2nd now, I don't know, in terms of reserves of oil and gas. But they have very, very expensive, let's say, luxurious emerald mines and gold mines as well in Venezuela. So I suppose if you look at all of that against the backdrop of what we're discussing with another Saddam Hussein episode, it's not impossible that we could be headed there.
Well, of course, Saddam fell because Russia was on the floor, drunk, having its pocket picked. Putin hadn't picked the country up and dusted it down then in 2003. In 2025, Venezuela has extensive relations, both with Russia and with China. Just signed a massive oil deal with China, and of course has a close relationship with Iran. And so it's all very circular, this. It's the same countries, it's the same actors being threatened by the same people. It's almost like war throughout the world, isn't it?
Well, to some extent, you have to admit that what's good for the goose is good for the gander. In other words, we've done these things to the Russians in countries that border them. We've been up to all sorts of malevolent activity in Central Asia, in places like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, as well as obviously Ukraine, also now in Azerbaijan, which we see as helping Israel on the one hand, encircle and potentially harm Iran, but on the other side of that coin, Azerbaijan helps us break off Iran from Russia and the One Belt, One Road program, the infrastructure project that provides for rail transportation all the way to and from Iran from Shanghai. So there are a lot of things going on. So it makes sense that you would move into the Caribbean, into our soft underbelly. I keep watching Mexico very carefully because Mexico has always sided with whomever was against us. And I'd be very surprised if we don't see similar mischief down in Mexico. We ought to wake up and recognize the futility of what we've done in the Eastern Hemisphere and come to some sort of arrangement with both China and Russia in the Western Hemisphere. Having said that, though, I don't think the Russians or the Chinese are as foolish as we are. From the very beginning, it should have been obvious to anyone with half a brain that we could not fight and win any conflict against Russia on Russia's doorstep. That's just stupid. Strategically, it's an impossibility. We could not have defeated Germany if we had not had allies in the East as well as in the West to attack Germany during World War II. It would have been impossible. The Germans would have defeated us if we had only had the British as allies and attacked from the West. So the point is, I think Mr. Putin is going to be limited in what he's willing to invest in mischief in the Caribbean directed at us. And I think the same thing is true for the Chinese. So they will give Maduro help, but they're not going to do for him what we've done for Zelensky, which is essentially unconditional support and unlimited funds. That's not going to happen. Nevertheless, it can do us a lot of damage, obviously. But right now, beware of something. 2 Russian bombers landed in Venezuela, and it was treated in Washington as though this was the beginning of a new world war. Well, that's absurd. First of all, neither of them were armed. Okay, let's be realistic. There's nothing happening down there that is so terrible that it threatens our long-term national security. The issue for us is drugs and the drug trafficking and the human trafficking. You don't have to invade Venezuela to stop that. That can be done in other ways. So hopefully someone will wise up and recognize that. We just need to defend our borders. We haven't done that, George, and it's stupid.
Is he a well man, Colonel? Donald Trump? Is he a well man?
You know, I'm not a physician and I can't evaluate. I just think that sometimes he's coherent and sometimes he's not. And I think that he's in a position where he operates on the basis of instinct and impulse. There is no long-term strategic goal in mind. That's the problem. There's no coherent national strategy, whether it's industrial, economic, military, political. I see no long-term strategy. There was none under Biden. This is not a new phenomenon in the history of my country. The United States emerged from World War II suddenly with a lot of money, very wealthy, very powerful, lots of capability, and decided the world was its oyster. And we started meddling everywhere. Well, we're running out of money, running out of resources. We're running out of political credibility and legitimacy at home as well as abroad. It can't go on much longer. But my point is that when you have no strategy, any road takes you where you think you want to go. And so you've got a lot of people standing around President Trump. Oh, forget Ukraine. That's a waste of time and money. Just do what you need to mollify Congress. Let's go after the real enemy in Venezuela. I'm sure that discussion's being heard in the Oval Office.
Another masterpiece from Macgregor. Thank you very much, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, retired U.S. Army Colonel, author and defence and foreign policy consultant.